The wind howled through the pines as Sarah drove down the winding road leading to Whispering Pines, Maine. The shadows lengthened with twilight, swallowing the landscape in a cold, ominous embrace. She tightened her grip on the steering wheel, her knuckles whitening as she fought the growing sense that something was terribly wrong. The small town appeared ahead, a cluster of pale lights against the rapidly darkening sky. Sarah swallowed hard, her throat suddenly dry. She didn't want to be there. Every fiber of her being screamed to turn around and run. But she had no choice. Her grandmother's inheritance, the infamous Blackwood house, awaited her. As Sarah entered the town's limits, a thick mist began to form, snaking through the streets like ghostly fingers. The few people visible on the sidewalks seemed to shrink away as she passed, their gazes a mixture of pity and fear. Sarah felt a shiver crawl down her spine. They knew where she was going. They knew what awaited her. Blackwood House stood on the outskirts of town, isolated at the end of a long dirt road. When Sarah finally saw the Victorian structure, her heart nearly stopped. The house loomed against the night sky like a malevolent shadow, its dark windows resembling hollow eyes watching her. The peeling paint and rotting wood told a story of decades of neglect and dark secrets. Sarah parked the car and sat for a moment, gathering her courage. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional creak of old wood and the whisper of wind through the trees. She could swear she heard distant voices, unintelligible murmurs that seemed to come from within the house itself. With trembling hands, Sarah grabbed her suitcase and approached the front door. The rusty key turned with difficulty in the lock, and the door creaked open with an agonizing groan. The air that escaped from inside was cold and laden with the scent of mold and something else, something rotten. Sarah stepped hesitantly inside, and the door closed behind her with a dull thud. She turned, startled, but the handle wouldn't budge. It was locked. "Welcome back, dear." The whispered voice came from everywhere and nowhere. Sarah spun, her heart pounding in her chest. There was no one there, only dancing shadows and the distorted reflection of her own pale face in a dusty mirror. That's when she noticed. The reflection in the mirror was smiling. Sarah screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the darkness of the house. The walls seemed to close in on her, the air growing thicker by the second. She felt cold fingers brush the back of her neck, a ghostly caress that made her shudder uncontrollably. "We've been waiting for you," the voice whispered again, this time right by her ear. "There's so much to show, so much for you to experience." The lights flickered, revealing for a brief moment distorted faces in the shadows, mouths open in silent screams. Sarah tried to run, but her feet seemed glued to the floor. The reality around her began to unravel, the walls dripping like wet paint, revealing a void of infinite darkness. And then, suddenly, everything went quiet. Sarah blinked, confused. She was standing in the middle of the living room, everything perfectly normal. No faces in the shadows, no whispers in the air. But the fear remained, a cold sensation that clung to every inch of her skin. Slowly, Sarah ascended the stairs, each step creaking beneath her feet. Upstairs, a long hallway stretched out, closed doors lining both sides. She knew she needed to choose a room to spend the night, but the thought of sleeping in that house made her stomach churn. When she reached the end of the hallway, she noticed something strange. There was an extra door, one she didn't remember seeing on the house's blueprints. It was older than the others, the wood darkened by time, with strange symbols carved into its surface. Sarah knew she shouldn't open that door. Every fiber of her being screamed for her to walk away. But her hand moved as if on its own, fingers brushing the cold doorknob. The door opened with a soft click, revealing impenetrable darkness. Sarah took a step forward, unable to resist the pull of the unknown. And then, without warning, Hands shot out from the darkness, grabbing her and pulling her inside. The door slammed shut behind her, silencing her scream of terror. Outside, Blackwood House remained still, patiently waiting for its next victim. The darkness was absolute. Sarah couldn't see her own hands in front of her face, let alone discern where she was. The air was thick, almost tangible, laden with the smell of damp earth and something else, something ancient and corrupted. Her fingers groped at the walls around her, feeling the rough texture of moss-covered bricks. A basement, maybe, or something worse. Hello? Her voice trembled, swallowed by the darkness. There was no answer, just a distorted echo that seemed to mock her. Sarah took a hesitant step forward, then another. Her bare feet, when had she lost her shoes, touched a cold, uneven floor. Something crunched beneath her feet, and she froze. Bones? No, impossible. Her mind was playing tricks on her. It had to be. A whisper emerged from the darkness, so faint that Sarah initially thought it was her imagination. But it grew, multiplied, until dozens, hundreds of voices murmured around her. Sarah, Sarah, welcome home. She spun around, trying to locate the source of the voices, but they seemed to come from every direction at once. Her heart pounded in her chest, her breathing growing faster and shallower. Suddenly, a faint light flickered in the distance. Sarah ran toward it, desperate for any escape from the suffocating darkness. As she approached, the light revealed itself to be a solitary candle, floating in the air with no visible support. The flame danced, casting shadows on the walls that seemed to move with a life of their own. And then Sarah saw it. The walls were covered in faces. Hundreds of faces in agony, frozen in expressions of absolute terror, their eyes following her every move. Sarah screamed, but no sound came from her mouth. She tried to run, but her feet seemed glued to the floor. The voices grew louder, no longer whispers, but agonized screams that reverberated through her bones. You're ours now, Sarah. Part of us. Part of the house. The candle flickered out, plunging everything back into darkness. Sarah felt cold hands touch her face, her neck, her arms. Ghostly fingers tangled in her hair, pulling her backward. And then, as suddenly as it had started, everything stopped. Sarah blinked, finding herself back in the upstairs hallway, in front of the mysterious door. It was closed, as if it had never been opened. Trembling uncontrollably, Sarah stepped back. Her foot hit something, and she looked down to see an old music box at her feet. It hadn't been there before, she was certain. With shaky fingers, Sarah picked up the box. A soft, melancholic melody began to play the moment she touched it. The music seemed familiar somehow, like a long-forgotten memory struggling to resurface. As the melody echoed through the hallway, the other doors began to open slowly, creaking on their hinges. Sarah looked from side to side, panic rising in her chest. Each room revealed was completely empty, except for dusty mirrors hanging on the walls. Sarah hesitantly walked toward the first room, the music box still playing in her hands. Her reflection in the mirror looked wrong, older, more tired, with eyes that had seen unspeakable horrors. When she blinked, the reflection changed. Now it was her grandmother's face staring back at her, eyes filled with infinite sadness. I'm sorry, dear. The reflection spoke, her grandmother's voice echoing both in the room and in Sarah's mind. I didn't want it to be this way, but the house always wins. The reflection began to change again, her grandmother's face melting like wax, revealing layer upon layer of faces. All familiar, all part of her bloodline, all trapped in the same expression of despair and regret. Sarah staggered back, dropping the music box. It shattered on the floor, the melody stopping abruptly. The silence that followed was deafening. She ran down the hallway, racing down the stairs in a frenzy of panic. The front door was there, her only route of escape. Sarah grabbed the handle, twisting it frantically. Locked. Of course it was locked. There's no way out, Sarah, her grandmother's voice whispered behind her. There never was. Sarah turned slowly, her body rigid with fear. Her grandmother was there, or something that wore her face. But the eyes were wrong. Empty. Dead. Blackwood House is more than just a building, the thing with her grandmother's face said, taking a step forward. It's a living entity, fed by the suffering of our family for generations. And now, it's your turn to feed it. The walls began to pulse as if they were breathing. The floor beneath Sarah's feet seemed to move, as though she were being swallowed by quicksand. As she sank, Sarah realized the horrible truth. She had never left that dark basement. The house had only been toying with her, showing her glimpses of an escape that had never existed. The last thing Sarah saw before the darkness consumed her completely was her grandmother's face, a single tear rolling down her ghostly cheek. The darkness was a living entity, pulsing around Sarah, swallowing her in its cold, viscous embrace. She didn't know how long she had been there. Minutes, hours, days? Time had lost all meaning in that abyss of horror. A sharp scream pierced the silence, and it took Sarah a moment to realize it was her own. Her throat was raw, her voice hoarse from all the screaming. But no one would come. No one ever would. Suddenly, flickering lights exploded around her, so bright they seared her retinas. Sarah screamed again, this time in pain, covering her eyes with her hands. When she finally managed to look, she wished she hadn't. She was in an endless hallway, the walls lined with mirrors. But the reflections, oh God, the reflections. Every mirror showed a different version of herself, each more horrifying than the last. In one, she was old and decrepit, her skin hanging from her bones like wet paper. In another, her face was disfigured, her eyes gouged out, leaving bloody, empty sockets. Sarah ran, trying to escape the terrible images. But no matter how fast she ran, the hallway seemed to stretch infinitely. Her legs burned, her lungs screamed for air, but she couldn't stop. Stopping would mean facing those reflections again, and she knew her sanity wouldn't survive. Why do you run, Sarah? Her grandmother's voice echoed down the hallway, coming from everywhere and nowhere. You cannot escape yourself. Sarah stumbled, falling to her knees. The ground beneath her was soft, warm, and pulsing. She looked down and screamed in pure terror. The floor was made of living flesh, veins throbbing beneath the surface. The walls began to move, the mirrors melting and dripping like liquid mercury. The flesh of the floor grew, wrapping around Sarah's ankles, pulling her down. No, please no, Sarah screamed, struggling to free herself. But the more she fought, the faster she sank. As the flesh swallowed her, Sarah saw flashes of memories that weren't her own. Generations of her family, each trapped in Blackwood House, each suffering unspeakable horrors. She felt their pain, their despair, their growing madness. And then she was back in the dark basement. But now she could see, and she almost wished she were blind again. The basement was enormous, far larger than it should have been, and on every inch of the walls, the floor, and the ceiling, there were faces. Faces of her family, twisted in eternal agony, their mouths open in silent screams. In the center of the basement stood a monstrous tree, its roots deeply embedded in the pulsating flesh of the floor. And hanging from every branch, Sarah fell to her knees, vomiting violently. Hanging from every branch of the tree was a body. Her mother, her father, her grandparents, aunts, uncles, cousins, all swaying gently as if moved by an unseen breeze. Welcome to the Blackwood family tree, dear. Her grandmother's voice came from directly behind her. Sarah turned slowly. Her grandmother was there, but not as she remembered. Half of her face was rotting, one eye dangling loosely from its socket. Maggots crawled through holes in her skin. "It's time for you to join us, Sarah." The thing that was her grandmother smiled, revealing rotting teeth. "The house is hungry, and you are the perfect sacrifice." Hands emerged from the floor, grabbing Sarah, pulling her down. She fought, screamed, begged, but it was useless. The last thing she saw before being completely swallowed was an empty branch on the monstrous tree, swaying as if beckoning her. Sarah woke up screaming, her body drenched in sweat. She was in a bed, the room softly lit by the light of dawn. For a moment, relief flooded her. It had been just a terrible nightmare. But then she looked out the window and saw the familiar fog of whispering pines. And on the bedside table, the old music box began to play its melancholic tune. The real nightmare had only just begun. The melody from the music box echoed through the room, each note reverberating in Sarah's bones. She wanted to move, to run, but her body wouldn't respond. Her eyes, the only part of her still obeying her will, frantically scanned the room. At first glance, the room seemed normal, but the longer Sarah looked, the more disturbing details emerged. The shadows in the corners pulsed as if they were breathing. The wallpaper, once an innocent floral pattern, now revealed tortured faces hidden among the petals. "I'm awake," Sarah whispered to herself, her voice trembling. "This is real." As if responding to her statement, the mirror on the vanity began to ripple like water. Sarah watched, paralyzed with terror, as a figure slowly emerged from the silvery surface. It was herself, but different, older, with eyes that carried the weight of decades of horror. Her distorted reflection smiled, a smile too wide to be human. "Hello, Sarah." The reflection spoke, its voice a grotesque version of her own. "Welcome to your future." Sarah tried to scream, but no sound came out. She watched helplessly as her reflection fully stepped out of the mirror, moving unnaturally, like a puppet controlled by invisible strings. "Don't fight it," the reflection said, approaching the bed. "It's easier if you just accept it. I fought for years, decades, but the house always wins." The reflection's hands, cold as ice, touched Sarah's face. At the moment of contact, a flood of memories, visions, poured into her mind. She saw herself, years into the future, wandering the halls of Blackwood House. She saw herself performing dark rituals in the basement, sacrificing unsuspecting visitors to feed the house's insatiable hunger. She saw future generations of her family, drawn into the trap of the cursed inheritance, each suffering the same terrible fate. "No," Sarah finally managed to scream, breaking the paralysis. She rose from the bed, stumbling away from her distorted reflection. "I won't become you. I will end this." The reflection only laughed, a sound that seemed to shatter reality itself. "You can't end something that has always existed and always will. Blackwood House is eternal, and now you are part of it." The walls of the room began to bleed, a thick, black liquid seeping down the surfaces. The floor beneath Sarah's feet softened, transforming into the same pulsating flesh as the basement. Sarah ran to the door, but when she opened it, there was only an abyss of darkness on the other side. She turned, cornered, as her reflection advanced. "There's nowhere to run," the reflection said, its form shifting and distorting. "There's no escape." Sarah closed her eyes, trying to block out the horror surrounding her. When she opened them again, she was back in the basement, the monstrous family tree looming before her. But something was different. There was a new body hanging from one of the branches. Sarah looked closer, and her heart nearly stopped. It was her. "This is how it ends," her grandmother's voice whispered in the dark. "This is how it always ends." Sarah fell to her knees, tears streaming down her face. The house pulsed around her, alive and triumphant. She could feel her consciousness fragmenting, pieces of her sanity falling away like dry leaves. But then, from the depths of her despair, a spark of determination emerged. Sarah stood, trembling but resolute. "No," she said, her voice growing stronger. "I won't accept this fate. I will fight." The house seemed to roar in response, the walls shaking with fury. But Sarah stood firm. "You've shown me the future," she shouted into the darkness. "But the future can be changed. I will break this cycle, even if it's the last thing I do." As Sarah made her declaration of defiance, something unexpected happened. A crack appeared at the base of the monstrous tree. A thin line of light piercing the oppressive darkness. The house trembled again, this time with what felt like fear. Sarah stepped toward the crack, determination shining in her eyes. She didn't know how, but somehow she knew that was the key to her freedom and the freedom of her entire family. But as she approached, the visions of horror intensified. Faces screamed from the walls. Hands emerged from the floor trying to grab her, the whispers of her ancestors begging her to give up. Sarah staggered, almost succumbing to the madness. But she kept moving forward, one step at a time. "I won't be your prisoner," she said through gritted teeth. "I won't be your puppet." Her fingers touched the glowing crack, and the world exploded in blinding light. When the light faded, Sarah found herself. The blinding light dissipated, and Sarah found herself back in the basement of Blackwood House. Her body trembled uncontrollably, drenched in cold sweat. The monstrous family tree was still there, but now it seemed smaller, less threatening. Sarah took a deep breath, trying to calm her racing heart. The house felt different now. The air was lighter, the shadows less dense. Something had changed. With hesitant steps, she climbed the basement stairs. Each creak echoed under her feet, but there was no longer that feeling of being watched, of walking on raw flesh. Upon reaching the main floor, Sarah was shocked. The house was in ruins. Broken furniture, torn wallpaper, shattered windows. It looked as if decades of neglect had descended upon the place in mere hours. Sarah walked to the front door, her heart pounding in her chest. She turned the doorknob, expecting resistance. The door swung open. The fresh morning air hit her like a wave, bringing with it the scent of pine and dew. Sarah stepped outside, then another. Nothing stopped her. She was free. But freedom came at a price. As she walked away from the house, Sarah felt the weight of what she had experienced. The memories of generations of suffering, the horror she had witnessed, the madness that nearly consumed her. All of it lingered. Sarah reached the main road of Whispering Pines. The town seemed normal, people coming and going, oblivious to the nightmare that existed among them. She pulled out her phone, surprised to see it worked. Only 2 days had passed since she entered Blackwood House. It felt like an eternity. With trembling fingers, Sarah dialed the police number. Whispering Pines Police Department. "How can I help?" A monotone voice answered. Sarah hesitated for a moment. How to explain the inexplicable? I need to report a crime," she finally said. "Several crimes, actually, at Blackwood House." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Blackwood House?" The officer's voice sounded cautious. "Miss, that property has been abandoned for years." "No, it hasn't," Sarah insisted, her voice gaining strength. "I was there. I saw things. Bodies. A family tree made of... Please, you need to investigate." Another pause. "All right, Mississippi. We will keep your anonymity. Can you provide us with more details?" And so, Sarah began to tell her story. Not all of it. There were parts that no one would believe, parts that she herself barely understood. But enough. In the days that followed, the town of Whispering Pines was shaken by shocking revelations. Excavations on the Blackwood property uncovered human remains, some dating back centuries. Documents found in the house exposed a dark history of kidnappings, occult rituals, and psychological manipulation that spanned generations. Sarah watched it all from a distance, having checked into a hotel in another town. She knew she would eventually have to return, give testimonies, face the consequences of being the last Blackwood. But for now, she allowed herself a moment of peace. Sitting on the hotel porch, watching the sunset, Sarah reflected on everything that had happened. The Blackwood house was not a supernatural entity. It was a monument to human evil, a prison built by generations of disturbed minds. And she, Sarah, had been the key to exposing it all. The nightmare was over, but its scars would remain forever. Sarah knew she would never be the same. The shadows she had seen, the horror she had experienced, would follow her for the rest of her life. But she was alive. She was free. And for the first time in generations, the cycle of horror of the Blackwood family had been broken. Sarah closed her eyes, letting the gentle breeze caress her face. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges. There would be questions, investigations, perhaps even trials. But that was tomorrow. For now, Sarah allowed herself a small smile. She had survived the House of Whispers. And now, finally, silence was welcome. The end.